Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's keynote presentation titled Using Computers to Characterize and Quantify Language and Face Expression in Schizophrenia. This webinar is part of the 12th annual event in the Neuroscience Virtual Event Series. I am Cassie Saltman of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our live chat feature during the presentation. You can find the live chat located at the bottom left of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you would like during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Submit. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, click on the Help Desk button from the lobby within the event. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education's credits image located on the right of your screen and follow the process to obtain your credits. Now let's get started. I now present today's speaker, Cheryl Corcoran, Associate Professor of Psychiatry, Program Leader in Psychosis Risk at the Icahn School of Medicine in Mount Sinai. For a complete biography on our speaker, please find it on the left of your screen. Cheryl, you may now begin your presentation.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all of the LabRoots staff who have been just wonderful, and I want to thank the audience for coming and listening to me today. I am following a very interesting talk by Dr. Schmidt on the social behavior of very highly gregarious cowbirds, songbirds, and his interesting talk on the smart aviary. This will be a little bit of a switch in that instead of songbirds, we'll be talking about humans and trying to characterize communication in a social context in humans and how that can often go wrong in different psychiatric illnesses, including in schizophrenia. So I am a psychiatrist, and I have been studying schizophrenia and its clinical risk states for many years. In psychiatry, unlike the rest of medicine, we don't really have any objective tests yet, which is remarkable. We make all of our diagnoses and decision treatments and even communication with patients and with other doctors, everything is done with language. And Steven Pinker at Harvard said language is a window into the mind. So with language, we also get a sense of what people are thinking. And as I mentioned, it's a primary source of data. We have primarily been rating language and face expression and other features that go into social communication simply by observing people and then giving a clinical rating, often between like 1 and 7. And, you know, that's a little bit subjective and it doesn't capture the full behavior of people when they're in social contexts, sort of in the wild. And so we really need to quantify behavior in psychiatry of humans. Key behavior that we look at is communication behavior, primarily in a dyad, that you could also look at larger groups. And you know, this is a focus of natural selection, right? You have to be able to communicate in order to survive, to have natural fitness. In terms of development, communication within a dyad begins in infancy, just sort of the gaze and the matching of speech and sounds. So communication is very important, social communication. And it often goes awry in different psychiatric disorders. And so then how can we measure or quantify it? Well, as it turns out, this sort of communication behavior is increasingly really easy to measure. All you need is a microphone and recording device, which we have all over the place, smartphones, tablets, laptops. And this kind of communication behavior within a dyad is very rich and complex. There's a time series, there's integration over different modalities, turn taking matters. There are many ways in which this can break down. It's remarkable that so many of us can do it. The individuals that I work with, they often describe having difficulty in communicating. So I am a schizophrenia researcher. I believe some of you will know about schizophrenia, but for those who don't, I'll give you a brief introduction. And this is really, sort of a use case for how we can use computers to study language and face expression in different psychiatric illnesses. So schizophrenia is characterized by psychotic symptoms, or they're also called positive symptoms, delusions, which are fixed false beliefs, hallucinations, also disorganized thought and communication. And this disorganized thought and communication is, I'll tell you in a little bit, one of the things that we've really tried to model using natural language processing, the sort of large language models that now everybody knows about, like ChatGPT, but we were using these models, we've used them for, say, the past 10 years, before they were generative, just to try to model what language samples we would have. And then in addition to psychotic symptoms, there are also expressive deficits and motivational deficits in people, a subset at least of people who have schizophrenia. And this also often can be sort of a flat affect or not much variation in prosody when people speak. Schizophrenia is also characterized by cognitive deficits in all of these different domains I mentioned here. So these all affect language, and language actually also affects how we measure these. So we know that there are processing speed deficits in schizophrenia for many people with schizophrenia, that and speed and synchronization is so important in language, and so that gets impaired. And then we can also use natural language processing, large language models, to look at some of the mood symptoms and even suicidal ideation and behavior. So this is just to emphasize that schizophrenia has a developmental trajectory. It's very interesting in that individuals who later develop schizophrenia often will seem within the range of being neurotypical, except for some slight developmental delays, and they tend to be include motor and also language areas. And so the language impairments that we see in schizophrenia have sort of an early emergence that become more evident over time. The research that I have done has been to look at adolescents and young adults who seem to be at clinical high risk for psychosis and schizophrenia. This is a group that has attenuated or subthreshold psychotic symptoms, so they may hear their name in the wind rather than hearing voices talking to one another, or they have unusual thoughts that have not yet reached delusional severity, where with a delusion, people sort of lose their skepticism. So these symptoms sort of emerge over time. And among individuals who meet these criteria, about 20% of them will go on to develop psychosis and schizophrenia. And for some subset of individuals who are at clinical high risk for psychosis and schizophrenia, it's been observed that they go off track a little bit, or their speech is a little bit concrete or simple, and this is associated with a doubling of risk for schizophrenia. I want to tell you a little bit about the language impairments that have been observed in schizophrenia, and also in some other psychiatric disorders that have psychosis, where it looks a little bit different, like bipolar disorder and mania. So in the 1970s, that's 50 years ago, there was someone named Andreasen who really created this heuristic. She noticed that that one feature of language is that people would go off track. They'd be tangential, they would derail. And another was sort of related to the negative symptoms, where there'd be a poverty of speech and a decrease in complexity. And what she had suggested 50 years ago was that it was important to let people just talk without interruption, and then sort of in a conversation, so you could observe their speech and language behavior. You see that without complicated experimental procedures. And this is the same tack that we have taken. And this is just to show that what these are each one of these is a word, and this is as people speak. And you could see in schizophrenia, and there are loops when people come back around. In schizophrenia, it's somewhat sparse. And then in bipolar, where there's a lot of this positive thought disorder, there's a lot of sort of going off track and coming back, and this is what the norm looks like. Okay, sorry. And then, so in individuals who are at risk for schizophrenia, there have been studies using clinical ratings primarily and some manual linguistic approaches, which are very labor intensive, better than the clinical ratings, but not as good as what I'll tell you about that we could do with computers now. This is my colleague, Diane Gooding, and she interviewed, or she had data of interviews of children whose parents had schizophrenia or mood disorder. And she used these ratings from the clinical scale from 50 years ago. And very interestingly, the clinical ratings were very predictive of outcome with like 90 to 94% accuracy. Both that tangentiality, the problem with coherence, going off track, as well as the less complex speech. So in people who are at high familial risk for schizophrenia, we could already see some of these language disturbances early on. And then in clinical high-risk cohorts, as I described earlier, and these are sort of teenagers, young adults who have attenuated psychotic symptoms, we've also done longitudinal studies, as I had mentioned, to see who develops schizophrenia. Are there characteristics of individuals that confer some predictive power that tell you that they're at particular risk? So this is another colleague of mine, clinical psychologist, Carrie Bearden, who's at the UCLA, and with individuals who are at clinical high risk. This was not open-ended interview, but she had them sort of recount a story that they heard and to tell a new story. And this was manual linguistic analysis. And, there were ratings of illogical thinking, poverty of content. Here are examples here. I went to school today because my name is Tom. It's not logical. And you see here maybe, well, yes, I see does not have a lot of content. And so she found that this is CHR plus, are those who went on to develop psychosis. The CHR minus did not. You could see that illogical thinking and poverty of content were features of language that among a group that was at risk was associated with an increased risk for developing psychosis, primarily schizophrenia. So I've given you this background in what schizophrenia is and what the sort of heuristics have been for understanding language in schizophrenia, and some of the studies in high-risk cohorts, either by virtue of familial risk or by clinical symptoms, and how these kinds of features of language disturbance that we see in schizophrenia are evident even before people develop what's called a first episode of psychosis, where they have hallucinations and delusions that really interfere with functioning, where skepticism is often no longer maintained. When people do develop a first episode of psychosis, it's very unlikely that they go off track an awful lot, but there's something about these language features that convey an increased risk for developing psychosis and having a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So if we use clinical ratings which support that, there are these language disturbances and manual linguistic analyses which are better but more labor intensive. The question would be, can we use automated natural language processing? And right now it's 2024. So we raised these questions 10 years ago. This was the beginning of a collaboration. You'll hear a lot today about team science. So this was team science. I am a psychiatrist, and I started working with individuals at IBM, mathematicians, physicists, engineers. And the question that I had, my agenda, was, the tools that they had, could they be applied to understand schizophrenia, what I've studied all this time, to really understand the disturbances in language, and then hopefully also face expression, which I'll get to a little bit later. But can computers be used to really characterize these disturbances in communication, which is so important for function? Unbeknownst to me, they had their own agenda, and I think team science works best when everybody is really motivated. And I did not realize till more recently that they were very interested in learning about psychiatry, so that the models that they built could sort of learn from what we do as psychiatrists when we talk to people and we make assessments of people. And that has now reached its full fruition in the generative large language models, right, like ChatGPT, that can be trained on a knowledge base. So this is, I just am putting this in about how good and how exciting team science is. So I've been working for a good 10 years, and the collaboration is really going strong with Guillermo Cecchi of IBM, who I learned is actually part of LabRoots. So when I first met Dr. Cecchi, and that was a decade ago, I really wanted to find out if someone could model going off track or being tangential. And at that time, the sort of word embedding program that was used was latent semantic analysis. And this comes from 1997. And Landauer was such a good writer. I would recommend him to all of you. He posited the question, I think it was called Plato's Dilemma. How can people know so much when given such little information? And that's because people will make inferences and they make associations. So you don't have to explicitly teach somebody something for them to know something. And so he built a model where basically it relies on matrices, and looked at a huge corpus of text. A corpus is just a grouping of text. Looked at a lot of text and looked at how often words would co-occur with one another. And words that co-occur with one another are assumed to have a kind of similarity that words that don't co-occur together have. And so you see here, you know, like red will go more with yellow and white, their colors, than it will with these others. And so this is the most complicated math in the talk. Each word would be assigned a semantic vector. He found 300 to 400 dimensions worked best. And the orientation for the word would index its semantic meaning, again, based on co-occurrence with other words. And then sentences or phrases are the sum of all of the word vectors. And then coherent, you know, so successive vectors will have different directions. And, you know, sort of here's one sentence, this is a heuristic, another sentence, and then here somebody goes off track, and, you know, the semantic content is a little bit different. And you can measure the extent to which people go off track by looking at the cosine between these successive vectors. So this was a way to look at semantic coherence. Now, 10 years later, people are not so much using latent semantic analysis. There have been development of word embedding programs, and now there's something what are called transformers, but all of them kind of have the same idea that the role of the word in terms of semantics depends on its co-occurrence with other words. And these are improvements on LSA in the ways that they consider the context. So you can imagine, you know, what a word means is going to be influenced by context. At least as a non-expert, that's my understanding. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong. In terms of complexity, we thought the best way to look at this would be part of speech tagging. So for those of you who are old in the audience, you may have seen this on chalkboards growing up. This is Chomsky, I'm sure you all know. And each word can be assigned a part of speech tag. And you're probably already thinking, I know of words that in different contexts can be a noun or could be a verb. Yes, you can account for that. But part of speech tagging, you have a sense of which parts of speech are being used. You can use part of speech tagging to determine how long sentences are. You can look at parts of speech such as determiners, which introduce dependent clauses, and that can tell you about complexity. So 10 years ago, and this is Dr. Checky, who I work with, and so we found in a very small cohort, it was grossly overfitted. There were 34 individuals who were clinical high risk and only 5 developed psychosis, but it was proof of principle and it kind of made a splash. And what we found, and here the data points in blue are the people who didn't develop schizophrenia, and the 5 who are red are the ones who did, only 5. And what this is a machine learning classification called convex hull. And a convex hull is the smallest space that a data set can occupy, I guess here in 3-dimensional space. So it's kind of like shrink wrapping your data. And so we were able to create a convex hull in which all of the people who did not develop schizophrenia were on the inside based on their language when we first met them, and the ones who did were on the outside. And then what were those features? They were the length of the sentence, so that's complexity. It was semantic coherence, that cosine similarity. When did they most go off track? And then determiners are the parts of speech that introduce dependent clauses, another measure of complexity. So this was sort of fun and proof of principle. It was actually very serendipitous. I advise everybody in life, but also in research to, chance favors the prepared, but serendipity plays a role. I had a research coordinator who was very interested in qualitative research and, said, I give people all these questionnaires. I really wanted to know what their experience is. I want to talk to them. And so we had all these transcripts. But so coherence and complexity, that has gotten some real traction. I believe that this is Shalila Haas. I believe that she's actually in the audience. And she took these measures of coherence and complexity in a newer cohort where we also had structural and resting state functional imaging. She did a canonical correlation, which is a correlation between sets of data. And basically what came out was that, these features of you hear coherence, sentence length, some other variables, prepositions popped up as well, were associated with structure. And if you look here, and I'm sorry if it's small, a lot of these brain regions are those that are involved in language. A lot of the temporal regions here, and also pars opercularis, pars triangularis, this is all inferior frontal gyrus, all involved in language. So not surprisingly, but nice as a validation, these sort of natural language processing metrics that we came up with were related to variance in structure and also in resting state functional connectivity with the language network. And another thing that we did, I don't have a slide, but I'll just mention it briefly, was that thought language communication scale from the 1970s. We did those ratings in the same clinical high-risk cohort for which we looked at coherence and complexity, showing convergent validity. So these measures of coherence, if you do them sort of clinically, if you do them using the computer, they are associated with one another. Well, in the past 10 years, this field has really taken off. Lots and lots of people are studying language in psychosis and schizophrenia. So you see here coherence and complexity. People have looked at coherence and complexity. They've looked at perplexity, which is how bizarre speech is. We're analyzing some data looking at metaphor, and interestingly finding that individuals with schizophrenia who are at risk for psychosis use more metaphor than others. You can infer symptoms. I'll tell you a little bit about that. Dialogue alignment, I could tell you more about if they're in the Q&A, where you can look at the alignment of dialogue between two individuals as they speak. You could compare the themes that come up with qualitative analysis and NLP. I told you a little bit about mechanistic studies. We're also looking at relationships with auditory processing and cognition. and we've looked at suicidal ideation as well. So let me tell you a little bit about these. So in schizophrenia and in clinical high-risk individuals, suicidal ideation is very common. The sort of a passive wish to be dead without a plan or intent can characterize up to 80% of people with schizophrenia who are at risk for it. So we did a study to, push to audience. We did a study to look at suicidal ideation in spoken language. We used the same approach that Nancy Andreasen uses, which is just to let people talk. If you let people talk, and people love to talk, they will talk about what interests them. They will talk about what's on their mind. So we have done these open-ended interviews. This is with clinical high-risk individuals who have these attenuated psychotic-like symptoms. And what we did was we did sentiment analysis. So I told you about coherence. I told you about complexity, but you could also use natural language processing to get a sense of the kinds of emotion that is in people's speech. You could look at that semantic similarity, that same, cosine similarity in vectors. You could use that not only to look at coherence over time, but in the actual semantic value of what people are saying. And so we decided to look at, we looked at many different things. We looked at anger, we looked at sadness. A BERT is a transformer that is a large language model, as latent semantic analysis is, as ChatGPT is. And there's a Go Emotions data set. This is an annotated data set of Reddit comments that yielded emotion categories. And we also used an unsupervised machine learning that classifies text without using labeled data, and the part of speech tagging that I told you about before. So here you see these are healthy individuals in blue, and in red, again, the cohorts are small. The individuals who had suicidal ideation are in red, and the clinical high risk who did not are in yellow. And what you can see in each case is that those individuals who had suicidal ideation, their spontaneous spoken language had more words with semantic similarity to anger, using two different measures. We also did part of speech tagging. We expected an increased use of the word I in individuals who had suicidal ideation. That has been found in other cohorts who don't have psychotic-like symptoms. We didn't see that, probably because they use I a lot anyway. But what we did find was a decreased use of words like would and should that we sort of have interpreted to mean less future direction, future orientation in speech. But that will be something that we will need to replicate in a larger cohort. We also have used NLP to apply clinical scales to spoken language. So I'll tell you the instance of our using this, but I'd like to emphasize at the end that this approach can be used for any type of clinical rating. So the approach here is that you have a clinical rating scale, and the rating scale has items. Those items are sentences. You could look at the semantic similarity of what people speak about spontaneously and see the extent to which it's related to items in a clinical rating scale. You could do this, you could imagine, for depression. We did it for something called psychotic-like anomalous self-experiences. So for many people with schizophrenia or young people at risk for schizophrenia, there are these feelings of not being real, disturbances in the experience of oneself and reality, the sense of watching yourself from outside, maybe fading from existence. This can be very troubling to people. And so there's a scale with many different items that describe that. Some of these are the items there. So what we did here from transcripts was we took all the sentences that began with the word I. We did that same kind of cosine similarity for each sentence with all of the different items. What we found was that individuals with these attenuated psychotic symptoms spoke a lot in a way that resonated with the items on the scale, even more so than individuals who had a first episode of psychosis. which may be that they're sort of grappling with what's a relatively new experience that's not been treated. So that we've used natural language processing for this as well. So I put this here. This could be a whole talk, and I hope we'll talk about it in the Q&A. So we're just starting to use ChatGPT to try to analyze language of individuals who have schizophrenia. We're also, by the way, collecting in these dyadic open-ended interviews language from individuals who have autism spectrum adults, individuals who have minimal cognitive impairment, who are at risk for Alzheimer's, also schizotypal, post-traumatic stress disorder, a number of different cohorts that we're studying. And I don't have time to go over that here. And those studies actually are pretty new. But what I've told you about thus far are these approaches with sort of word embeddings and part of speech tags. There are other approaches as well. As I mentioned, with ChatGPT, things now get very different, because you can talk to ChatGPT, you can come up with prompts, you could ask ChatGPT, sort of analyze the language as well. So in addition to the actual words that people speak, just to go back to schizophrenia and clinical high risk, in schizophrenia, it's common for many individuals to have very long pauses. So there's sort of abnormal pauses, and pauses and turn taking in a dyad are really very important. They're a sort of metronome for the conversation, and a long pause represents a violation, such that everything has to be kind of reset. And I've spoken with many individuals with schizophrenia who are at risk for schizophrenia, and they describe their struggles with figuring out the tempo of conversations, also planning to say something, but it takes a little bit of time, and by the time they're ready to say it, the conversation has moved on. So this kind of slowing and these pauses are problematic. This was a medical student we had, and she looked at the interview level, and she found that the pauses in speech were related to syntactic complexity. So the people who had more concrete speech also had longer pauses, also had more negative symptom severity. So at this point, I will move on to talk about integrating not just spoken language, the words people say, its complexity, coherence in a dyad, the acoustic values, the pauses, but also face expression. So when people are speaking, they're also communicating with their face and face expressions and making gestures. And this is really the natural ecology of face-to-face interpersonal interactions. I think it's both in person and increasingly, just like we're doing now, it's via platforms such as Zoom. This is not telepsychiatry, but telepsychiatry as well. And so we're really interested in looking not just at like the content of speech, but the delivery of speech across all of these different modalities while individuals are in a dyad and they're speaking. And I mentioned how important turn taking is, and also the need for synchronization and speed in successful communication. So to talk a little bit about face expression. So I mentioned serendipity earlier, in that I had a research coordinator who was interested in qualitative research. So we had all these transcripts when I met people from IBM. So I'm not quite sure I want to say the pandemic was serendipity necessarily, but for us, there was a silver lining. So for a few years, we were really trying to decide in person, how do we do the setup? This is like 7-8 years ago, I guess, right? 2020, about 4 or 5 years ago. Where do you put the cameras? How do you sync the audio and the video? We really wanted to look at everything together. It was challenging. And then with COVID, that's COVID there, then we had Zoom. And so with Zoom, everything synchronizes. and everything is automatically recorded, and you can get audio from 2 different individuals. You don't have to diarize or separate the audio, which you have to do for in-person. And this also is a natural ecology of dyadic communication, increasingly, is virtual platforms. So we have been looking at face expression. So only 15, 20 years ago, people were really struggling to figure out how to measure these face action units in video. And now it's just all open source software for face expression, and also for prosody and acoustics. There's PRAD and Open Smile for those. There's Open Face for this. So face action units, have innervation. They've been validated against electromyography. They have a known neural circuitry, and you can measure these in video. And this is Icahn. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And we have been particularly interested in this Action Unit 7 and Action Unit 6. The early studies looking in schizophrenia, trying to do this with video, found that this orbicularis oculi, or lid tightener, seemed to be decreased in amplitude in individuals with schizophrenia. And just to mention, there's a long history of looking at face expression, and to emphasize how, yes, this is probably related to natural selection. Darwin was particularly interested in face expression, not only in humans, but non-human primates. He identified in this figure on the left a woman with depression, and called that sort of furrowing of her brow the omega sign, as a sign of melancholia. And then he was also interested in sort of smiles, and probably many of you have heard about Duchenne smiles or smizing. On the left, of course, is politicians, where one is genuinely smiling, the other not. And sort of Duchenne smile or smizing is also smiling with your eyes. And on the right, you see the same individual smiling. On the left is this sort of what people think of as a general smile that involves the eyes, and on the right not. And so in schizophrenia, for a lot of individuals, like when they smile, it's not being communicated as much in their eyes. So this Action Unit 7 is very interesting because it's involved in smiling, but also is involved in sort of social signaling more generally, even beyond happiness. So this has seemed to be impaired in schizophrenia. And this is just also to show, this is a Duchenne smile in a non-human primate, and on the right is a heuristic that's a courtesy of Catalin Gothard, who studies non-human primates. And you can see here the upper part of the face has a somewhat different innervation pattern than what you see for the lower face. So this is interesting to us also, because if in schizophrenia it's mostly Action Unit 7, that may tell us something about like where in the sort of limbic motor system things may be going awry. And this M3 is in the dorsal cingulate. It's just interesting that we can start to think about the anatomy. So for face expression, what's known in schizophrenia and clinical high risk, clinical ratings, not all people with schizophrenia or at risk have flat facial expression. This is considered one of the negative symptoms. Some people have more negative symptoms, some have fewer, so it's very heterogeneous. There were these early video coding studies. UPenn had a number of small pioneering studies, but it seemed again and again that this Action Unit 7 orbicularis oculi was implicated. More recently, there have been studies with proprietary software that don't necessarily look at face action units, but do configurations of face action units, say, to come up with joy or smile, and this is decreased in schizophrenia and clinical high risk and associated with clinical ratings. So we use Zoom, and I just put these methods up. It's so easy to do. There are standard operating procedures I could give to people. When we now do recordings over Zoom, we make sure we turn everything off that the company designs to sort of facilitate communication, but might sort of interfere with the actual data itself. And we have used an open-ended interview. We basically ask people, how have things been going lately? And the goal is for them to speak freely. So this is just to show some very preliminary results. And again, with Team Science, this is Stephen Heisig, who I work with very closely, who's an engineer and has been studying face expression, not only in psychosis and schizophrenia, but with Helen Mayberg, looking at treatment-resistant depression using daily diaries. But here in individuals with schizophrenia, this is a sort of comparison of schizophrenia and people who do not have schizophrenia. And the green is where the amplitude is less. So we're finding among individuals with schizophrenia that they have decreased amplitude in these areas. In Action Unit 7 in particular, but more broadly, in clinical high risk or much more heterogeneous, we don't see such clear group differences, but in the heterogeneous group, we do find that these amplitudes are related to clinical ratings of face expression and to some extent with social function. Another way that Steve Heisig has looked at face expression is to create matrix profiles. So very simply, you can look at motifs and how often they repeat. So here in these figures on the bottom, each arc shows when a new facial configuration becomes evident. On the left is somebody who's healthy, and on the right is someone who has schizophrenia, who happens to have negative symptoms, and they have a much limited sense of repertoire, limited repertoire of face expressions. And again, if we look in clinical high-risk individuals, these repertoires are related to symptom severity and also to function. So these are the tacks that we're taking now to try to look across modalities, to have time series for both interlocutors in a conversation, so we can determine where the pauses occur by having the audio. We can look at pitch. We can look at face action units. We often find that when people are listening, their amplitude drops quite a bit, which is interesting. Why would that happen? Why would someone's face become more flat in expression when they're listening? And it's not just the muscles that are used to speak, but so we'll look at time series of individuals as they speak in conversation. Steve Heisig has been looking at facial mimicry and synchrony. So here, in order to, there's so many configurations that you could have with face action units, and you could use those motifs, but instead, Steve has been using facial expression labels that were developed this is a deep neural network model that was developed by Cohen. It was described in Nature in 2021. The software has been available to us. And here what you could see on the top is somebody who's a healthy individual. On the bottom, someone with schizophrenia who has negative symptoms. And you can see that not only the expression of the person with schizophrenia is less than what you see, but it influences the people who they're talking to as well. That person, and this is this kind of facial mimicry, and people have described this also in autism with acoustics, etc., is that individuals will sort of pick up on one another. So the research coordinator here who's doing the interview, in being sympathetic, their face expression also decreases. It's very interesting. And we can look at mimicry, which is a very, very short time scale, and you can see the orange and the green tightly are correlated on top and much less so on the bottom. And the more sort of varying over the larger time frames is a kind of synchrony, and not just the motor mimicry, but also the reflection of emotion. So I'm almost out of time. I'll tell you a little bit more. People always ask about technical issues. Can it influence turn taking? Can it affect eye contact? What about latency? What about Zoom fatigue? So you could read this briefly. I could talk about it more, but Stephen Heisig is doing empirical testing, really tries to address this. Yeah, he's an engineer. There are some real advantages with using a Zoom platform. There are a lot of people who don't want to come in person. You can separate the speech pretty easily. This is perhaps more great. You could reach people in rural settings, etc. So there's something to be said for that. And then here, this is Steve again trying to figure out the lag. Ethical issues following me will be Dr. Laura. You'll hear a talk about ethics. I can't believe I'm blanking on her name. There are a lot of issues that come up with having this kind of data that you collect on individuals. Can people truly give informed consent? Is there bias in the data sets? Who owns the data? How do you protect privacy? How do you integrate this with other sensors, et cetera? And then there are open questions about, especially in psychiatric cohorts, the associations with ratings I spoke about a little bit, but, sources of variance, context, how do you elicit speech? Is this in person? Is it via telehealth? Increasingly, a lot of groups, including Heisig and Mayberg, are using daily diaries, and people love to talk to themselves day in, day out. To talk to the phone and just for like a few minutes to describe their day. Is it acceptable? Is it scalable? For schizophrenia, individuals have trouble often with recognizing emotion in faces. So to what extent is that associated with the difficulty for some individuals in expressing their emotions? That's an open question that, if you're interested in schizophrenia pathophysiology, would be of great interest to you. And then just broadly, how can these kinds of studies inform what we do clinically? How do we integrate this with neural circuits? What are the best analytic models? What about, what are the challenges? And what about other neurological disorders? And I will end there with a photo of many of my colleagues and the distribution of this. I amuse myself. This is sort of Australia. Here's like Norway. Here's South America. Here's where we are in New York. Some friends in California and some Europeans, etc. Thank you. And any questions and comments, I welcome them. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your informative presentation. We will now begin the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just submit your question into the Ask a Question box located on the bottom of your screen. Let's go ahead and get started here. Our first question asks, since many other diagnoses can influence language processing, including depression without psychotic components, what is the rate of false positives when using automated language processing?
This is an excellent question. So the first thing I would like to say is that this field is not advanced enough yet to go into the clinic. And so to go to the clinic, you really need to know about false positives and false negatives. So we're not there yet. And that's even sort of compared to individuals who don't have any diagnosis at all. And by collecting data using the same strategy now at Mount Sinai for different kinds of cohorts. So like, for instance, we are also, as I mentioned, collecting data for individuals who have autism spectrum disorder, PTSD. Other researchers have looked at depression. We're looking at Alzheimer's. So it's really an empirical question. I think the stage that we're at now, when we use the same approach to collecting data, the same sort of standard approach, then we can start to look to see what's specific and what is not. So, what was the question with depression with respect to what, sentiment analysis? was that, sorry, can I see the questions? Or can you
Yes.
just repeat that first part again? There
I
it
can
is.
repeat it. It says, since many other diagnoses can influence language processing, including depression, without psychotic components.
Right. So the measures of coherence where people derail and go off track seems to be related to psychosis. We don't really see that kind of derailment or people going off track in depression in the absence of sort of the kind of psychosis and negative symptoms and cognitive deficits that you see in schizophrenia. The complexity we see also in Alzheimer's and in people at risk for Alzheimer's, that there's a decreased complexity. Interestingly, in Alzheimer's, some studies have found this decrease in coherence. The studies that have been in depression, there are a lot of acoustic studies, so you could really, there are features of depression that can be picked up pretty easily with acoustics. You sort of slower speech, more of a monotone, almost like sad sounding speech. And then sentiment analyses also will pick up on depression. For the suicidal ideation that I discussed, where we looked at individuals at clinical high risk, there is a review looking at NLP with suicidal ID. It correlates with suicidal ideation and behavior by someone named Homan in 2022. And almost all of their studies were with individuals who had depression. And so, like, for instance, what we found with anger and sadness has been found also in depression as well. So some things cross and some things don't, but it's not, there are people who are trying to use this to at least screen within the general population for individuals who may be at risk for different disorders, but it's not even close to being something that could be administered to make diagnoses in the clinic.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, we have a couple more questions here in the inbox. Our next question asks, do you notice any difference in indices by language or cultural differences, and can these classifications be adapted to be useful across populations?
Is there a way that I can see the questions? Oh, is it the question mark? Yeah, okay.
So
Because
on the very left,
I see. So
on the very left of your screen, you should see a Q&A.
So which one is this? 876.
I just flagged it, number 6. Mm-hmm.
Number 6. Okay, I'm sorry. I understand things better when okay. This is also another great question. So about language and cultural differences. So most of this has been done with language, not so much face expression. Someone I have collaborated with, Natalia Mota in Brazil, and Guillermo has as well. That very first study that I showed from 10 years ago on coherence and complexity, she took the machine classifier that we generated from the clinical high-risk cohort and found that among Brazilian patients with schizophrenia and healthy individuals, it was able to distinguish them with sort of 70 to 80% accuracy. These measures of coherence and complexity have now been done in many different, in psychosis in particular, and schizophrenia have been done in many different countries, and coherence often comes up. There has been sort of letting 100 flowers bloom, and that people have looked at other ways to look at coherence and complexity, and that seems to also come up. There are some very nice studies, though, showing like using the same measures and showing how they exist in some languages, but not necessarily in others. Guillermo and I did a study doing natural language processing analyses, also acoustics, in a cohort of Chinese individuals, Mandarin speaking in Shanghai. We published this, and we used the same open-ended interview. And I'll try to keep this brief, but I think it's really cool. So Guillermo did sort of English language NLP on translations of the transcripts, but also had somebody in his group who is bicultural, bilingual from China, who did Mandarin-based NLP. So two really interesting things. The measures of coherence using the English NLP and the Chinese NLP were both popped up as different, and those variables were actually correlated with one another. So we thought this coherence thing is pretty robust. You can capture it even when you do translations of transcripts. The cool thing, well, I think it's all cool. The other cool thing about this was that when you use a language-specific NLP approach, you could pick up things that of course, you wouldn't pick up by doing English language NLP of the translated transcripts. So, for instance, English NLP, the approach does not, account for what are called localizers in. Please go away. Localizers in Mandarin. There are sort of tags to speech that are used as localization, and that differentiated the clinical high risk from the healthy individuals when analyzed with Mandarin-based NLP, but we would have never picked that up with the English language NLP.
Fantastic, thank you. And I want to say here, I think we have time for just one more question. So I'm going to flag that one for you so you see it. But for the audience, unless you have a preference. Did you have a preference for which one?
I like the males versus females. So I can see the remaining few. Males versus females, that's great. Our cohorts have been small. I haven't seen any studies that describe big sex differences. So that's a great question, but we always think about it, but nothing is really popping up. We had this coherence and complexity. We looked at a very large cohort, a population-based cohort. We didn't find sex differences. We found that coherence and complexity, as you would guess, sort of improved from adolescence into young adulthood. And then there's a question about medication. So that's an excellent question. Most of the, I didn't mention it for each of the slides that I had, but most of them were controlled for age, sex, and medication. So of course, if someone has psychosis and that's treated, there's a good chance their language will improve. But so medications can treat this. So, and that matters for group differences, but doesn't really change the correlations between the computational variables and the clinical ratings. I will finish on one thing about medications, which I think is very interesting. So, in antipsychotic medications that many people with schizophrenia take can cause sort of Parkinsonian-like extrapyramidal symptoms, including face expression. I described how in schizophrenia, it seems more to be around the orbicularis oculi, these muscles around the eyes. But what the antipsychotic medications do, Parkinsonian symptoms are much more around the mouth. So there seems to be a different sort of distribution. So sex differences, medications. How might these tools be used in future clinical evaluations? I think in the short run, until they improve in accuracy, they'll be used mostly for screening. The main thing that we're also focusing on, again, like looking at correlations with brain structure and function and what I described about the anatomy in non-human primates, right, for the upper face, the lower face, is to really understand. We still don't, schizophrenia, it's remarkable how little we understand. We've studied for decades, but we don't really have a good handle yet on what leads to decreased face expression. Is it limbic? Is it motor? Is it kind of in between? So these are also tools for mechanistic studies as well to develop biomarkers that might respond to treatments.
Thank you, Cheryl. I wanted to ask, do you have any final comments for our audience before we go?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. These were fantastic questions. I'll be back for the later panel, and just thanks. And thanks to you as well.
Great. Thank you again, Cheryl Corcoran, for your time today and your important research. Before we go, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us and for their interesting questions. Any questions that we did not have time for today and those submitted during our on-demand period will be addressed by our speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. This webcast can be viewed on demand for 1 year until March 6th, 2025. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.